Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Kyo Kim. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken talked on the phone with South Korean Foreign Minister Jong about the recent developments in North Korea, agreeing to explore humanitarian initiatives on the Korean peninsula. The phone call came as Kim Yojong, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's sister, practically demanded South Korea to cancel the joint military exercise with the U.S. just a few days after South and North Korea reopened their communication channels. Today we'll discuss these and more. Joining me is Bruce Klingner, Senior Research Fellow for Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation's Asian Studies Center. Mr. Klingner served as CIA's Deputy Division Chief for Korea. Alex Wong also joins me today. Mr. Wong is Senior Fellow at Hudson Institute. He most recently served as the Deputy Special Representative for North Korea at the U.S. Department of State. Welcome to the program. Good to have you both.
Well, thanks for having us.
Good to be here.
Before we talk about the phone call between the top diplomats of the U.S. and South Korea, let's start with Kim Yojong warning annual summertime military drills between South Korea and the United States will cloud the future of inter-Korean relations. The warning came just a few days after South and North Korea reopened the communication channels. Mr. Klingner, what is the intention of the North Korean regime practically demanding to cancel this joint military exercise after raising hopes for dialogue?
What North Korea giveth, Kim Yo-jong taketh away. Last week, when North Korea said it would be willing to resume communications, which was simply their willingness to pick up the phone after a year delay, then there was a lot of optimism by some that this would lead to a plethora of more summits and progress in negotiations, et cetera. But then just shortly after, Kim Yo-jong sort of came in as the bad cop, saying that anyone considering it more than simply resumption of communications was misguided. And then, like a good Chicago gangster, a nice place you got here, it'd be a shame if something were to break. She said the message to Seoul was, if you want an improvement in inter-Korean relations, then you'd better cancel those military exercises with the U.S. So it's highly conditional that they resume the communications.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Wong, why does North Korea keep bringing up the U.S.-South Korea joint military exercise? It seems like they see the exercise as some kind of cards that can be negotiated.
Well, I agree with a lot of what Bruce said. This is not just something they bring up every year. They bring it up more than once a year with every time we do have a scheduled exercise, a joint exercise with South Korea. Look, from a purely military standpoint, of course, if you could have your opponent not exercise, not enhance jointness, not enhance their ability to quickly respond to any contingency, of course you'd want to do that. But I also do think that perhaps some parts of the North Korean regime have internalized the exercises as some sort of affront. And I think they're mistaken in that. And I don't think it actually accords with their own military and defense logic. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. I was in Hanoi negotiating in advance of the Hanoi Summit. And in one of my conversations with a counterpart on the North Korean side, the topic of military exercises did come up. And he asked me why we weren't doing more to even further downgrade the exercises that we had lengthened out and downgraded. And I said to him, North Korea also has its own exercises. North Korea also makes sure that its military is ready to respond. And I asked him whether he was willing to make changes to their military exercises in response. And he looked at me and he said, Mr. Wong, I don't know if you know anything about militaries, but militaries have to train. And I responded to him that I do understand things about the military and that I agreed with him.
Mm-hmm. Some South Korean lawmakers and activists are calling for postponement of the military exercise. Mr. Klingner, is this worrisome in terms of possibly eroding the U.S.-ROK alliance?
Yes, it is. For the last 4 years, we've either canceled or downgraded or reduced countless military exercises. I think 13 exercises were canceled in the first year or two after the President Trump's unilateral decision. And so any degradation in training can lead to a degradation in the allied deterrence and defense capabilities. So the longer that we don't train to the same level we were, first as a diplomatic gesture, And then because of COVID restrictions, it runs the risk that our militaries won't be as effective in deterring and defending. It's like if an Olympian athlete wasn't training the last month or two before the games, there's that risk that they won't do as well. And when it comes to the military, has potentially very deadly consequences.
Mr. Wong, from what you see, what is the fundamental stance of the Biden administration about this joint military exercise?
Right. Well, I can't speak specifically for the Biden administration. I departed government in January. But I will say, look, the long-standing position of the United States is that any decision on exercises, any decision on readiness will be taken in conjunction with our ally, South Korea. And I'm sure those conversations are ongoing now. But we also have the parallel, very clear policy that the U.S. military that is in South Korea, together with our ally, will be ready to, quote unquote, fight tonight and be ready to defend South Korea in any contingency. So that's the position. Now, as far as its connection to negotiations, as you know, President Trump and our administration, we did downgrade and lengthen out exercises. But we did so not just to better the environment for talks, but as a condition or something that is contingent on the North Koreans forthrightly and in goodwill engaging in negotiations. So that's what we have to see from the North Koreans, a willingness to talk and to talk in good faith.
Mm-hmm. And as you said, during his direct diplomacy with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, former President Donald Trump decided to scale down the U.S.-South Korea joint military exercise. Was that helpful in the following talks with North Korea?
Right. As I said, it's very important to understand what that decision was. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't simply to quote unquote improve the atmosphere. It was contingent on the North Koreans and Kim Jong-un being in good faith engaged in negotiations. So at the same time that it may have improved the environment for talks, improved the tenor of our interactions, it also provided us some leverage, provided the North Koreans with more incentive to stay at the table and engage in the types of talks we needed to settle on a roadmap toward denuclearization.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Klingner, there's speculation coming out of South Korea that the joint military exercise this month may be scaled back as well. Will this facilitate talks with North Korea?
No, but first of all, it's hard for them to be scaled back any more than they are without just simply canceling them. They're already just tabletop computer exercise simulations. There are no troops that are going to be going out in the field. And the August exercises were before one of the two big major exercises where troops were out in the field. So we're already downgraded it to computer simulations. So that has an effect. It's some training, but it's not as good as real world training. So during the 4 years that we've curtailed or cut back or canceled exercises, it didn't lead to any reciprocal North Korean gestures on either the security side or on the diplomatic side. As Alex pointed out, they continue to do their winter training cycle, their summer training cycle, and other exercises. So we didn't get anything in return for this unilateral concession on canceling and downgrading our exercises.
Mm-hmm. Moving to a little bit different topic. Right after the restoration of the communication channels, the spokesperson for South Korea's presidential office said, hopefully that this could lead to another summit between South Korean President Moon Jae-in and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. And Kim Yojong, however, said that it'll be a premature and hasty judgment to talk about an InterKorean summit. Mr. Klingner, why the difference of sentiment here?
Well, I think it's characteristic that the South Korean government is very optimistic or projecting a sense of optimism that they hope any kind of gesture by the North or the South or the U.S. would lead to a resumption of dialogue and perhaps even negotiations. So the Moon administration is trying to spin everything as positively as it can. There were media reports that the two Koreas had discussed a virtual summit, which the South Korean presidential office denied. But North Korea, through Kim Yo-jong, has said, that's not the case, and it's very highly conditional any kind of improvement in relations. So We don't know what we don't know. We don't know how much interaction there has been between the Koreas behind the scenes, or indeed with the U.S. and North Korea. But so far, we're not getting any signals out in front of the curtain that there's any kind of movement by North Korea to agree simply to have talks.
Mr. Wong, did you get the sense that the North Korea regime trying to set up some preconditions before having the InterKorean Summit?
Right. First, the premise of the question is the summit, I think, is still up in the air. I think it makes some sense that the time that President Moon had in office began with major summits with Kim Jong-un, that perhaps at the end of it, there would be an attempt, if it made sense, to also have a summit to see if they can make some further progress at the end of his administration. Now, as far as preconditions, I did see some reports that there have been some requests, at least, for certain sanctions relief for certain commodities and even luxury goods being moved into North Korea, perhaps as a precondition to discussions. I'm not sure of the provenance of those reports, but it doesn't surprise me that there might be an attempt by the North Koreans to extract some concessions, some benefit from the simple fact of returning to the table. Now, I will say that I think it's inadvisable to do that. I think it's inadvisable to make the fact of talking the item for which any country, but North Korea in particular, is rewarded. They should be rewarded for real action, and talking should be simply assumed to be what you do when you are involved in a negotiation and discussion in an effort to move forward.
And just before the ASEAN Regional Forum, where North Korea usually participates, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and South Korean Foreign Minister Yong talked on the phone. And Secretary Blinken said he reaffirmed U.S. support for inter-Korean dialogue and engagement. The two sides agreed to explore humanitarian initiatives in the Korean Peninsula as well. Mr. Wong, do you think there is some progress towards talks?
Well, first of all, I think that the statement was helpful. I think the statement actually shows a lot of continuity between what we had done in the Trump administration and now what the Biden administration is doing, in a sense that you can look at inter-Korean rapprochement, inter-Korean cooperation as a mutually reinforcing activity together with the denuclearization process and the negotiation between North Korea and the United States. Now, I think we have to talk about and be careful about exactly what activities are undertaken under the rubric of inter-Korean cooperation. But if it is focused on humanitarian aid, if it is focused on cooperative efforts that could build trust, build a rhythm of cooperation, whether it's, for instance, remains recovery was an activity that we undertook with North Korea as well as South Korea. Those things can be very helpful to build momentum towards real discussion on at least on the hard matters of denuclearization.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Klingner, your thought is the United States ready to give the humanitarian aid to North Korea?
Well, I think as Alex has said, we need to distinguish between humanitarian aid and assistance and economic benefits. So what many people don't understand or don't realize is that there are no sanctions on humanitarian assistance or provision of food, aid, medicine. So the poor condition of the North Korean populace is because of the North Korean government and its policies. So, and the Trump administration last year offered assistance on COVID, before we had a vaccine, and North Korea rejected it, as they rejected South Korean offers of $11 million of rice, et cetera. So, the outside world has offered humanitarian assistance. North Korea has rejected it. But on either reduction of sanctions or providing sort of large-scale economic benefits, as the Moon administration wants to do, that would be premature before North Korea comes back to the negotiations and actually we create the framework of an agreement where both sides or all sides will take certain steps in conjunction with steps by the other side. And what those steps would be and the linkages, well, that's the subject of negotiations.
Mm-hmm. In the meantime, South Korea's spy agency said in a parliamentary briefing that North Korea is currently demanding permission to export minerals and import refined oil and other living essentials as prerequisites for reviving dialogue with Washington. while South Korea's foreign ministry said this specific demand from North Korea was not discussed with the U.S., does this suggest there was some kind of engagement behind the scenes among the U.S., South Korea, and North Korea? Mr. Klingner.
Well, certainly there's behind the scenes and in front of the curtain discussions between Washington and Seoul. And it seems perhaps that the North and South Korean intelligence organizations have maintained some level of contact. And we've seen reports that the two Korean leaders exchanged letters, though we don't know the contents. Whether the U.S. and North Korea have had interactions, I think seems doubtful, because the Biden administration earlier this year said that they had tried several times, and North Korea admitted that the Biden administration had tried several times to engage in dialogue, and Pyongyang had rejected it. So, but all of these restrictions on North Korea's economic activity are the subject of either UN resolutions or U.S. laws, and those are all a reaction to North Korean aberrant behavior or previous violations of UN resolutions and U.S. laws. So, giving relief from a response to an aberrant action, is not how you should do negotiations. It's like a bank robber saying, well, how much money will you give me to walk back into the room to talk about me giving back the money that I stole from the bank? That's not how you should run negotiations.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Wong, did North Korea lay out similar demands when the U.S. and North Korea were more actively talking, including in the Hanoi summit?
Well, it was a different context. To the extent that report is accurate, what they seem to be asking for here is some upfront concessions simply to talk. In Hanoi, we were already engaged in talks. We were engaged in preparing for a summit and seeing we can hammer out an agreement for our leaders to bless at Hanoi. And in that negotiation leading up to Hanoi, you'll remember the demand and the request from North Korea was essentially full sanctions relief in exchange for undefined part of the Yongbyon facility. So it was a very different context, a very different demand, one that we ultimately said no to. So very, very different in nature than the current situation.
All right. Then what is your assessment of the current situation?
Well, we'll see. I think it's not unpositive and unsignificant that there's been the rekindling of the liaison channel that North Korea had destroyed a little over a year ago. It does indicate to me there's some interest from their side in some discussion. Now, what their ultimate end goal is unclear. If it is simply concessions to return to talks, I don't think that's helpful. If it is charting a way forward where they can make some progress and develop a rhythm of negotiation, whether it's under the rubric of the Panmunjom and Pyongyang declarations signed earlier in the Moon administration, that might be helpful. But what I do think is helpful is that the U.S. and South Korea do appear to be very coordinated in analyzing these recent developments, responding together, and moving together as allies.
And as Mr. Wong pointed out, the current situation is different from the past, the talks between the U.S. and North Korea, for example, in Hanoi. Mr. Klingner, I understand that your view is that U.S. shouldn't compensate to make North Korea come out to the talks. Is that right?
Yeah, we shouldn't pay a door prize just to get them in the door. So sanctions relief and economic benefits and many other items, sort of different administrations from the U.S. and South Korea have sort of offered those up on the table, but they have to be part of a comprehensive, integrated agreement. So, each side is going to have to take positive steps towards the other, but they have to be linked. You can't be required to offer up concessions before you even get into the room just to get them to the table. I think that really calls into question the sincerity of the other side if they're demanding payment even just to talk.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Wong, if the U.S. and North Korea starts talks, when will be the right time for the U.S. to consider easing sanctions on North Korea? And will shutting down Yongbyon plus Alpha help?
Well, I think the big question there is what's the alpha? The main issue with the offer that was presented to President Trump at Hanoi was the simple fact that while Yongbyon is a significant part of the nuclear program and the WMD program of North Korea, it's nowhere near all of it. So if that is the offer on the table in exchange for full sanctions relief, what that would have put the United States and really the world in the position of doing was financing and funding the ongoing production of weapons of mass destruction in North Korea. So you're going to have to deal with that issue that whatever the alpha is, it cannot put the free world in the position of funding the WMD that are the threat to the world that we're trying to deal with. So as Bruce said, and I think is right, the key here is for the North and the United States, and together with interested parties, to settle on what the end state we're all moving toward is, detail that end state, but then map out a comprehensive roadmap that about, yes, denuclearization, but all of the pieces of the relationship, whether it's peace regime, economic development, sanctions relief, humanitarian work, that will go into that and make it enforceable and make it clear. And we can move down that roadmap toward the end state that we all agree to.
My last question for both of you. First, Mr. Wong, will the humanitarian aid from the United States be good motivation for the North Korea to come out to the talks, or is there anything else the U.S. should do to persuade them to come out?
Right. Well, I do think it's clear that the United States stands ready to talk. So it's not a question about willingness to talk with North Korea. The question is whether North Korea is willing to, whether it's because of the COVID restrictions they have, some other trepidation they have about the administration, or other political considerations they have. It's hard to know what is keeping them from talking. As far as what more the U.S. can do, on the humanitarian question, I want to be clear that, as Bruce said, there's no restriction on humanitarian aid. And the choices that the United States makes, as well as the international community and a number of NGOs about humanitarian aid, should be based upon the humanitarian need of North Korea. And there's ongoing and constant discussions about how best to calibrate that kind of aid and to make sure that it's not diverted to benefit just the regime elite, but it goes to the North Koreans who do need it. But I'm not naive enough to say that humanitarian aid will not have some positive effect on the relationship. So if there is some way to move forward within our humanitarian aid policy, together with South Korea, that can have ancillary positive beneficial effects on the motivation of the North Koreans to negotiate, that's not a bad thing.
And Mr. Klingner, your final thought?
Well, I think on sanctions relief, we need to distinguish a number of things. One is the difference between UN and U.S. sanctions. So UN sanctions are largely a restriction on economic activity by North Korea. And those, I think, are more negotiable. It could be for certain steps, for every certain North Korean weapons given up or destruction of or dismantlement of facilities, they can export X tons more of their goods. U.S. sanctions are different. They apply to human rights, they apply to criminal activity, and a lot of those can never be removed because it's defending the U.S. financial system against financial crimes such as money laundering, or there are legal requirements in the North Korea Sanctions and Policy Enhancement Act on steps that North Korea has to take before a U.S. president can either reduce for 1 year or remove sanctions. So the UN sanctions are the more negotiable ones, but again, North Korea has to come back to the table.
Mm-hmm. And the U.S. and South Korea have been closely discussing the current situation on the Korean Peninsula following the reopening of the communication channels between two Koreas. As the U.S. and South Korea continue to emphasize the importance of lockstep coordination in the North Korean issues, we'll have to watch what the next move will be for the alliance in engaging with North Korea. Mr. Wong and Mr. Klingner, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. It was great to be here.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.